thrust his sword into the left side, and she saw a deeply parlor face across his face. Like an abruptly lowered curtain. Reiko had to struggle to prevent herself from rushing to his side. Whatever happened, she must watch. She must be a witness. This was her duty to her husband. He had laid upon her. Opposite her, a match space away, she could clearly see her husband biting his lip to stifle the pain. The pain was there, with absolute certainty, before her eyes, and Reiko had no means of rescuing him from it. The sweat glistened on her husband's forehead. The lieutenant closed his eyes and opened them again, as if experimenting. The eyes had lost their luster and seemed innocent, empty like the eyes of a small animal. The agony before Reiko's eyes burned as strong as the summer sun, utterly remote from the grief which she had seemed to be tearing herself apart within. The pain grew steadily in stature, stretching upward. Reiko felt that her husband had already become a man in a separate world, a man whose whole being had been resolved in pain. A prisoner in a cage of pain, where no hand could reach out to him, but Reiko felt no pain at all. Her grief was not pain. As she thought about this, Reiko began to feel as someone had raised a cruel wall of glass between herself and her husband. Ever since her marriage, her husband's existence had been her only existence, and every breath of his had been a breath drawn by herself. But now, while her husband's existence in pain was a vivid reality, Reiko could find this grief of hers no certain proof all of her own existence. With only his right hand on the sword, the lieutenant began to cut sideways across his stomach, but the blade became entangled with the entrails as it was pushed constantly outward by the soft resistance. And the lieutenant realized that it would be necessary, as he cut, to use both hands to keep the point pressed deep into his stomach. He pulled the blade across and did not cut as easily as he had expected. He directed the strength of his whole body into his right hand and pulled again. There was a cut of 3 or 4 inches. The pain spread slowly outward from the inner depths until his whole stomach reverberated. It was like wild clanging of a bell, or like thousands of bells, which jangled simultaneously at every breath he breathed, and every throb of his pulse, rocking his whole being. The lieutenant could no longer stop himself from moaning, but by now the blade had cut its way through the navel, which he had noticed, felt a sense of satisfaction and a renewal of courage. The volume of blood had steadily increased and now spurted from the wound as if propelled by the beat of his pulse. The mat before the lieutenant was drenched with splattered blood, and more blood overflowed onto it from pools which gathered in the folds of the lieutenant's khaki trousers. A spot like a bird came flying across to Reiko and settled on the lap of her white silk kimono. By the time the lieutenant had last drawn the sword across the right side of his stomach, the blade was already cutting shallow, and had revealed its naked tip, slippery with blood and grease. But suddenly stricken by a fit of vomiting, the lieutenant cried out hoarsely. The vomiting made fierce pain fiercer still, and the stomach, which had thus far remained firm and compact, now abruptly heaved, opening wide its wound. The entrails burst through as if the wound were too vomiting. Seeming ignorant of their master's stuttering, the entrails gave an impression of robust health and an almost disagreeable vitality as they slipped smoothly out and spilled over the crotch. The lieutenant's head dropped over his shoulders, his heaved, his eyes opened to narrow slits with a thick trickle of saliva dribbled from his mouth. The gold markings of his epaulets caught the light and glinted. Blood was scattered everywhere. The lieutenant was soaked in it to his knees, and he sat now in a crumpled and listless posture on one hand on the floor. A raw smell filled the room. The lieutenant, his head dropping, reached repeatedly, and the movement showed vividly in his shoulders. The blade of the sword, now pushed back by the entrails, exposed to its tip, was still in the lieutenant's right hand. It would be difficult to imagine a more heroic sight than that of the lieutenant at this movement. He mustered his strength and flung back his head. The movement was performed with sudden violence, and the back of his head struck a sharp crack against the alcove pillar. Reiko had been sitting until now with her face lowered, gazing in fascination at the tide of blood advancing towards her knees, but the sound took her by surprise and she looked up. The lieutenant's face was not the face of a living man. The eyes were hollow, the skin parched, the once lustrous cheeks and the lips colored of dried mud. The right hand alone was moving, laboriously gripping the sword. It hovered shakily in the air like the hand of a marionette and strove to direct the point of the base of the lieutenant's throat. Reiko watched her husband make the last most heart-rending, fertile exertion. Glistening with blood and grease, the point was thrust at the throat again and again. Each time it missed its aim. The strength to glide it was no longer there. The straying points stuck the collar and the collar badges. Although its hooks had been unfastened, the stiff military collar had closed together again and was protecting the throat. Reiko could not bear the sight any longer. She tried to go to her husband's help, but she could not stand. She moved through the blood on her knees, and her white skirt grew deep red. Moving to the rear of her husband, she helped no more than by loosening the collar. The quivering blade at last contacted itself to the naked flesh of the throat, and at that moment Reiko's impression was that she herself had propelled her husband forward, but that was not the case. It was a movement planned by the lieutenant himself as a last exertion of strength. Abruptly, he threw his body at the blade, and the blade pierced his neck, emerging at the nape. There was a tremendous spurt of blood, and the lieutenant lay still, cold, blue-tinged steel protruding from his neck at the back. Slowly, her socks slippery with blood, Reiko descended the stairway. The upstairs room was now completely still. Switching on the ground floor light, she checked the gas jet and the main gas plug and poured water over the smoldering, half-buried charcoal in the brazier. She stood before the upright mirror in the 4.5 mat room and held up her skirts. The bloodstains made it seem as if a bold, vivid pattern was printed across the lower half of her white kimono. When she sat down before the mirror, she was conscious of the dampness and the coldness of her husband's blood in the region of her thighs, and she shivered. Then for a long while she lingered over her toilet preparations. She appeared rose generously to her cheeks and her hips. Too, she painted heavily. This was no longer makeup to please her husband. It was makeup for the world which she would leave behind. There was a touch to the magnificence and the spectacular in her breastwork. When she rose, the mat before the mirror was set with blood. Reiko was not concerned about this. Returning from the toilet, Reiko stood finally on the cement floor of the porchway. When her husband had bolted the door here last night, it had been in preparation for death. For a while she stood immersed with consideration of a simple problem. Should she now leave the bolt drawn? If she were to lock the door, it could be that the neighbors might not notice their suicide for several days. Reiko did not relish the thought of their two corpses putrefying before discovery. After all, it seemed it would be best to leave it open. She released the bolt and also drew open the fronted glass door a fraction. At once a chill wind blew. There was no sight of anyone in the midnight streets. The star glittered ice cold through the streets in a large house opposite. Leaving the door as it was, Reiko mounted the stairs. She had walked here and there for some time, and her socks were no longer slippery. About halfway up, her nostrils were already assailed by a peculiar smell. The lieutenant was lying his face in a scene of blood. The point protruding from his neck seemed to grow even more. Let's see. Lost my spot. The eyes were open wide, as if the lieutenant's attention had been attracted by something. She raised the head, folding it in her sleeve, wiped the blood from his lips, and bestowed a last kiss. Then she rose and took from the closet a new white blanket and a waistcord. To prevent any derangement of her skirt, she wrapped the blanket about her waist firmly with a cord. Reiko sat herself on a spot about 1 foot distant from the lieutenant's body. Drawing her dagger from her sash, she examined its fully gleaming blade intently and held it with her tongue. The taste of the polished steel was slightly sweet. Reiko did not linger. When she thought how the pain, which had previously opened such a gulf between her and her dying husband, was now about to become a part of her own experience, she saw before her only the joy of herself entering a realm with her husband had already made his own. In her husband's agonizing face, there had been something inexplicable, which she was seeing for the first time. Now she would solve the riddle. Reiko sensed that at last she too would be able to taste the true bitterness and sweetness of that great moral principle which with her husband believed. What had until now been tasted only faintly through her husband's example, she was about to savor directly with her own tongue. Reiko rested to the point of the blade against her base of her throat. She thrust hard. The wound was only shallow. Her head blazed, and her hand shook uncontrollably. She gave the blade a strong pull sideways. A warm substance flowed into her mouth, and everything before her eyes reddened into a vision of spouting blood. She gathered her strength and plunged the point of the blade deep into her throat.